in the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where mountains guard ancient secrets and bloodlines run as deep as coal seams. The Caldwell family vanished without a trace during the harvest of 1889, a family whose members claimed they could speak with the deceased, but whose true legacy was written in shared blood and twisted genes. This is their story. Autumn had painted the Appalachian hillsides in fiery hues when Sheriff Thomas Blackwood first rode into Caldwell Hollow. The year was 1889, and these remote Kentucky mountains harbored communities largely untouched by the industrial progress reshaping America's cities. The narrow dirt road wound through dense woodland before opening onto a small clearing where several dilapidated cabins clustered around a central well. The settlement appeared deserted. No smoke rose from chimneys despite the October chill. No children played in the yards, and the fields of corn stood partially harvested, as if the workers had simply walked away mid-task. The Caldwells had lived in this hollow for over 70 years, narrates Dr. Eleanor Simmons, historian at the University of Kentucky. They arrived in the early 1800s, 3 brothers and their wives, and rarely ventured beyond these few acres. By 1889, the family had grown to nearly 30 individuals. Those census records are incomplete for such isolated areas. What made the Caldwell family notorious in neighboring communities wasn't merely their seclusion, but their claims of communicating with the departed. Locals whispered that the Caldwells conducted strange rituals in their cabins during new moons, speaking in tongues and receiving messages from deceased relatives. These practices earned them both fear and fascination from surrounding communities. It wasn't supernatural abilities, explains Dr. James Harrison, geneticist and author of Isolated Communities. The biological consequences the Caldwells exhibited. Classic signs of generational consanguinity, blood relatives reproducing with one another over multiple generations. The family's unusual behaviors, physical characteristics, and cognitive patterns were likely manifestations of recessive genetic disorders, amplified through continuous family unions. Sheriff Blackwood's journal, preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, describes his first impressions. The Caldwell property shows signs of hasty departure. Meals left half-eaten on tables, tools abandoned in fields, livestock unfed. No blood nor signs of struggle, yet no family member can be located. Neighbors report hearing strange chanting the night before they disappeared. The most disturbing discovery came when Blackwood entered the main cabin, belonging to Jeremiah Caldwell, the family patriarch. A crude family tree had been carved into the wall lines, connecting names and patterns that revealed the true nature of the Caldwell lineage. Cousins had wed cousins. Uncles had taken nieces as wives. The brothers and sisters had produced children together. The diagram told a story of systematic consanguinity spanning 3 generations. Families like the Caldwells weren't uncommon in extremely isolated regions, continues Dr. Harrison. Geographic isolation combined with social ostracism created conditions where intermarriage became normalized within the group. The physical and cognitive effects would have become increasingly pronounced with each generation, according to local accounts collected by Sheriff Blackwood. The Caldwells exhibited distinctive physical traits: unusually close-set eyes, malformed limbs, and pronounced facial asymmetry. Children born in recent years rarely survived infancy. Those who did reach adulthood often displayed erratic behavior and diminished cognitive abilities. Martha Jenkins, whose family owned the general store in nearby Pikeville, provided a rare glimpse into interactions with the Caldwell family. Her diary entry from April 1888 reads, "Ezekiel Caldwell came to purchase supplies today. His gait remains unsteady, and his speech nearly incomprehensible. He brought the young boy again, the one with the misshapen head and vacant stare. The child never speaks, only rocks back and forth." Other customers left when they entered. I cannot help but pity them. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. These forbidden family histories reveal the dark side of America's past, that history. Books never taught you stories that will forever change how you understand human nature and the fragile boundaries of civilization. Jeremiah Caldwell, the 68-year-old patriarch, held absolute authority over the family. His father had established the settlement in the early 1800s, and Jeremiah had continued the tradition of keeping the bloodline pure. County records indicate he had fathered children with at least 3 women within the family, including his first cousin Rebecca and, most disturbingly, his half-sister Mary. The isolation of these mountain communities created a perfect storm for consanguineous relationships, explains social historian Dr. Patricia Coleman. Without outside contact or education, and with strong patriarchal control, these practices could continue for generations. The family members often didn't understand the connection between their intermarriage and the increasing health problems plaguing their children. What happened to the Caldwell family? Why did they abandon their home so suddenly during the harvest season? The mystery deepened when Sheriff Blackwood discovered a leather-bound journal belonging to Jeremiah Caldwell. The final entry, dated October 17, 1889, the day before their disappearance, contains a cryptic message. They speak louder now. The dead warn us the blood has grown too thin. We must join them beneath. Only there will the voices quiet. As night fell on Caldwell Hollow, Sheriff Blackwood departed, promising to return with a search party. The mystery of America's most infamous consanguineous family was just beginning to unfold. The morning sun cast long shadows across Caldwell Hollow as Sheriff Blackwood returned with a 7-man search party. The eerie silence remained unbroken as they methodically examined each cabin, the fields, and the surrounding woods. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of life within the isolated community. The living conditions were deplorable, writes Blackwood in his official report. Evidence of extreme poverty and neglect throughout. Several crude beds in each cabin, often with 5 or more occupants sharing a single room. In the smallest cabin, we discovered what appeared to be a makeshift infirmary where the family's most afflicted members were kept. This infirmary, a dark room with boarded windows and dirt floors, contained 3 bed frames with leather restraints. The search party found personal items, children's toys, hand-carved figures, and clothing, but no indication of where 30 people had gone overnight. Dr. Malcolm Reed, a physician who accompanied the search party, documented the medical evidence. The Caldwell family displayed classic manifestations of consanguinity across generations. I examined hair samples, personal items, and crude medical tools found on the property. The family suffered from numerous genetic disorders, including hemophilia, as evidenced by bloodied bandages and homemade remedies for bleeding. Several children's garments showed signs of physical deformities in the wearers. The investigation revealed that the Caldwell family had existed almost entirely outside society. Few had birth certificates. None had received formal education. Their interactions with neighboring communities were minimal and primarily handled by Jeremiah and his sons Ezekiel and Isaiah, who occasionally traveled to Pikeville for supplies. The family's so-called ability to speak with the dead was likely a manifestation of neurological disorders, explains Dr. Harrison. Temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, and other conditions occur with higher frequency in consanguineous populations. These conditions can produce auditory hallucinations, voices that family members genuinely believed were their deceased ancestors communicating with them. The search party's most significant discovery came when they explored the area behind the main cabin. There, partially hidden by overgrowth, they found a family graveyard containing dozens of crude markers. Many were for infants and children. The dates revealed a disturbing pattern. Child mortality had increased dramatically in recent generations. Each generation of consanguinity compounds the genetic issues, Dr. Harrison continues. Recessive genes that cause serious disorders become increasingly expressed. The Caldwell family cemetery tells the tragic story through dates and ages. Each generation lived shorter lives and experienced more severe health problems than the last. Sheriff Blackwood ordered the search expanded beyond the immediate settlement. Tracking dogs were brought in but lost the scent at the edge of a stream running through the property. The search continued for weeks, expanding to nearby caves and abandoned mining operations. But no trace of the Caldwell family was ever found. Local rumors suggested various explanations. Some believed neighboring families had finally taken action against the Caldwells, viewing them as an abomination. Others claimed the family had fled to even more remote mountains to continue their isolated existence. The most persistent theory involved an abandoned coal mine 2 miles from the hollow. The mine had been closed since 1882 after a collapse killed 3 workers, explains local historian Gregory Whitman. It's possible the Caldwells, in their deteriorating mental state, sought refuge underground, believing they were literally joining their ancestors beneath, as Jeremiah's journal suggested, if they entered the unstable mine. A further collapse could have sealed their fate. During the expanded search, investigators discovered evidence of the family's extreme isolation and the development of their own internal culture. They had created a unique dialect, combining English with unfamiliar terms believed to be their own inventions. They maintained peculiar rituals documented in Jeremiah's journal, including blood-mixing ceremonies, where family members would combine drops of their blood in a shared cup, a symbolic reinforcement of their biological connections that unknowingly celebrated the very practice destroying their genetic health. The Caldwells created their own mythology around their declining health, says anthropologist Dr. Sarah Jenkins. Rather than understanding it as the consequence of consanguinity, they interpreted their increasing afflictions as evidence of special sensitivity to the spirit world. The more severe their disabilities became, the more they believed they were chosen as vessels for ancestral communication. The search party discovered another troubling aspect of the family's practices. In a locked chest in Jeremiah's cabin, they found detailed records of arranged unions within the family. Young girls were promised to cousins or uncles as young as age 12. The documentation showed a systematic approach to maintaining what Jeremiah called the sacred bloodline, with explicit instructions for continuing these arrangements for future generations. As weeks passed with no sign of the missing family, public interest waned. The case would have faded into obscurity if not for an academic study published in 1912 by Dr. William Thompson of Johns Hopkins University, who used the Caldwell case as an early example of the devastating effects of prolonged familial intermarriage. The disappearance of the Caldwell family represented the culmination of a tragic biological process, Dr. Thompson wrote. Their bloodline had become so compromised through generations of consanguinity that nature itself seemed to intervene, bringing their lineage to its inevitable conclusion. The investigation into the Caldwell family's disappearance took an unexpected turn in December 1889, 2 months after they vanished, when a hunter discovered an abandoned campsite deep in the mountains, 15 miles from Caldwell Hollow. Among the items found was a shawl identified as belonging to Sarah Caldwell, Jeremiah's youngest daughter. This suggested at least some family members had fled into the wilderness rather than meeting a sudden end. Sheriff Blackwood organized another search, but winter snows soon made the mountain terrain impassable. By spring, any trail had long vanished. The mystery might have ended there, but in May 1890, a letter arrived at the Pikeville post office addressed simply to the people of Pike County. The handwriting matched samples from Jeremiah Caldwell's journal. "We have found peace beyond the veil," the letter read. "The voices of our ancestors guide us to a new beginning. The blood must be renewed. Do not seek us in this world." The postmark indicated it had been mailed from Roanoke, Virginia, nearly 200 miles away. This correspondence sparked renewed interest in the case. Had the entire family somehow traveled to Virginia? If so, how had 30 people, many with severe physical disabilities, made such a journey unnoticed? And what did Jeremiah mean by the blood must be renewed? The letter suggests Jeremiah had recognized the genetic deterioration of his family, says Dr. Harrison. His reference to renewing the blood likely indicates a belated understanding that new genetic material outcrossing with unrelated individuals was necessary for the family's survival. Court records from Roanoke revealed that local authorities conducted a search for the Caldwells but found no trace. However, they did discover that a man matching Jeremiah's description had purchased supplies sufficient for a large group, paying with gold coins, before disappearing again. The investigation uncovered disturbing details about life within the Caldwell family. Interviews with residents of neighboring communities painted a picture of a clan increasingly ravaged by the effects of consanguinity. Martha Jenkins, the Pikeville shopkeeper, described her last encounter with Ezekiel Caldwell just days before the family's disappearance. "He came in babbling about voices getting louder," her statement reads. "His speech was worse than ever, barely comprehensible. He purchased candles, salt, and rope in large quantities. When I asked about his family, he said they were preparing for the journey beneath. I thought he meant they were storing food for winter. Now I wonder if they had planned their disappearance all along. If you've ever felt a chill when passing an isolated mountain home, wondering about the secrets hidden within its walls, type 'The Blood Speaks Through Generations' in the comments. Your voice joins those who refuse to let America's darkest family histories remain buried." Dr. Malcolm Reed, who had examined items from the Caldwell homestead, provided expert testimony about the family's medical condition, based on descriptions from witnesses and physical evidence from their dwellings. The Caldwell family exhibited numerous disorders consistent with consanguinity: hemophilia, polydactyly, microcephaly, and various cognitive impairments. The most recent generation showed the most severe manifestations, suggesting the genetic load had reached a critical threshold. The mystery deepened when investigators interviewed elderly residents who recalled the Caldwells' arrival in the area. According to these accounts, the original 3 Caldwell brothers who settled the Hollow in the early 1800s had themselves fled from another community in North Carolina under suspicious circumstances. There were whispers even then, stated 92-year-old Abigail Parker in her testimony. "My grandmother told me the Caldwell brothers had been driven out of their previous home because they had married their own cousins, and produced children of questionable parentage. They came here to escape judgment and continue their practices in isolation. This suggested the pattern of consanguinity predated their Kentucky settlement, potentially extending the family's inbreeding by additional generations. Census records from North Carolina confirmed that a Caldwell family had indeed left the Smoky Mountain region around 1815 under unexplained circumstances. In July 1890, a peculiar discovery added another layer to the mystery. A surveyor mapping mining claims found a series of symbols carved into trees along a remote trail leading away from Caldwell Hollow. The markings matched symbols found in Jeremiah's journal, apparently part of the family's private communication system. The trail of markings led to the edge of a steep ravine before abruptly ending. They had developed their own symbolic language, explains linguist Dr. Rebecca Townsend. Isolated communities sometimes create unique communication methods. These symbols combine primitive pictographs with letters, forming a rudimentary code that only family members would understand. The trail of markings suggests a planned exodus rather than a panicked flight. The ravine where the markings ended became the focus of renewed search efforts. At its bottom, searchers found a small cave entrance partially concealed by fallen rocks. Inside, they discovered evidence that a large group had sheltered there, briefly ashes from fires, discarded food wrappers, and a child's doll identified as belonging to one of the Caldwell children. But the cave held a more disturbing revelation. On its back wall were handprints in red clay, dozens of them, in various sizes from adults to small children. Beneath the handprints, more symbols had been carved into the soft stone, which Dr. Townsend later translated as, "The voices led us here. The deeper path awaits." The cave had a narrow passage leading further underground, but a recent collapse had sealed it. Despite efforts to excavate, the unstable conditions made further exploration impossible. What lay beyond that collapsed passage, whether an underground route the family had taken or perhaps their final resting place, remains unknown to this day. The evidence suggests the Caldwells deliberately staged their disappearance, concludes historian Dr. Eleanor Simmons. Whether driven by Jeremiah's deteriorating mental state, fear of outside intervention, or genuine recognition that their bloodline had grown dangerously compromised, they chose to vanish rather than face the consequences of generations of consanguinity. As winter approached again, the search for the Caldwell family officially ended. Their abandoned hollow was eventually reclaimed by the forest, the cabins collapsing under successive seasons of snow and rain. All that remains today are foundations overgrown with wildflowers and the small family cemetery with its testament to genetic tragedy etched in dates and names. In 1895, 5 years after the Caldwell family vanished from Kentucky, a physician in southwestern Virginia documented his encounter with a group of people displaying unusual physical characteristics consistent with generational consanguinity. Dr. Edward Holbrook's medical journal, discovered during historical research in 1967, describes treating a young woman with distinctive features that matched descriptions of the Caldwells. The patient exhibited microcephaly, close-set eyes, and 6 fingers on each hand, Holbrook wrote. She identified herself only as Mary of the Sacred Blood. When questioned about her family, she became agitated, repeating that the ancestors forbid speaking to outsiders. Her companion, an older male with similar physical characteristics and severely impaired speech, hurried her away before treatment was complete. This tantalizing clue suggested that at least some members of the Caldwell family had survived and continued their nomadic existence. However, Dr. Holbrook's description indicates their genetic conditions had not improved, suggesting any renewal of the blood Jeremiah had mentioned had not occurred or had been insufficient to reverse generations of genetic damage. Further evidence emerged in 1897 when a rural church in Tennessee reported a strange encounter. Pastor William Hayes described a group of 15 individuals who arrived at his church one Sunday, their appearance causing his congregation considerable distress. They bore physical deformities that many found disturbing, Hayes wrote in his church records. Their leader, an elderly man who walked with difficulty, requested permission to bury one of their number, a young child, in our cemetery. When I inquired about their origins, he would only say they were travelers from Kentucky, following ancestral voices. Permission was granted, and the group conducted a peculiar burial ceremony involving chanting in an unrecognizable language and the placement of personal items belonging to adult members into the child's grave. They departed immediately afterward, traveling on foot into the mountains. The child's grave marker, a simple wooden cross, bore only the inscription, "Caldwell blood returns to earth." Forensic anthropologist Dr. Lauren Mitchell, who studied these historical accounts for her 2010 book, America's Lost Families, believes these sightings trace the gradual dissolution of the Caldwell family unit. What we're seeing is likely the final chapter of a biological tragedy, she explains. The family appears to have fragmented into smaller groups after leaving Kentucky, perhaps as members died or as internal conflicts arose. Each sighting shows fewer individuals, suggesting their numbers were rapidly declining. The most significant insight into the Caldwell family's final years came from an unexpected source. In 1902, anthropologist Frederick Wilson was documenting Appalachian folk practices when he encountered an elderly woman living alone in a remote cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. She identified herself as Rebecca Caldwell, claimed to be 81 years old, and said she was the last voice of the sacred bloodline. Wilson conducted several interviews with Rebecca over a period of months, gaining her trust and recording her account of the family's history. According to Rebecca, who may have been Jeremiah's cousin and one of his wives, the Caldwell patriarch had become convinced that their settlement in Kentucky had been tainted, and that the family needed to return to their ancestral homeland in North Carolina to purify the bloodline. Jeremiah heard the ancestors most clearly, Rebecca told Wilson. They told him our blood had grown too thin, that the sacred connection was fading because we had settled in the wrong hollow. The voices said our children were being punished because we had strayed from the original ground where our blood first entered the earth. Rebecca's account revealed the extent of the family's shared delusions, reinforced through generations of isolation and consanguinity. She described elaborate rituals where family members would enter trances and communicate with deceased relatives, receiving instructions that invariably reinforced Jeremiah's authority and the necessity of maintaining blood purity through family marriages. Most significantly, Rebecca revealed the family's ultimate fate. According to her testimony, the Caldwells had journeyed for months through the mountains, losing several members to exposure and disease along the way. Upon reaching what Jeremiah claimed was their ancestral homeland, a remote valley in the North Carolina mountains, they discovered another family had settled there. Jeremiah said the ancestors were angry that outsiders had taken our sacred ground, Rebecca recounted. He said the voices demanded sacrifice to reclaim the land. That night, he and my sons took up weapons and went to the outsiders' cabin. I heard screams. When they returned, their clothes were stained red. We took possession of the cabin before dawn. This confession suggests the Caldwell family's journey ended in violence, a desperate attempt to establish a new isolated homestead where they could continue their practices. According to Rebecca, this new beginning was short-lived. Within 2 years, most of the remaining family members had died from disease, malnourishment, or complications from their genetic conditions. The younger generation, most severely affected by consanguinity, produced no surviving children. The voices finally went silent, Rebecca told Wilson in their final interview. The sacred blood ends with me. Wilson planned to return with authorities based on her confession to the apparent murders. But when he came back to the cabin, Rebecca had died. Her body was positioned ceremonially, surrounded by family artifacts, suggesting she had prepared for her death as the last act of the Caldwell family ritual. Frederick Wilson's field notes, rediscovered in the University of North Carolina archives in 1978, provide the most complete account of the Caldwell family's final chapter. His description of Rebecca's cabin included a crude family tree etched into the cabin wall similar to the one found in Kentucky but with many names crossed out, tracking the family's decline to its final member. The Caldwell case represents the inevitable biological conclusion of extreme genetic isolation, says Dr. Harrison. What makes their story particularly tragic is how they interpreted their deteriorating health, not as a warning, but as a sign of special status. Their beliefs created a self-reinforcing cycle where the very practices destroying them were celebrated as spiritual gifts. The exact location of this final Caldwell cabin has never been determined. Wilson's notes provide only vague geographical references, and subsequent searches have failed to identify the site. Like their original settlement in Kentucky, all physical traces of the Caldwell family have been reclaimed by the Appalachian wilderness. Today, more than 130 years after the Caldwell family disappeared from their Kentucky hollow, their story continues to resonate as a powerful example of how isolation, misinformation, and biological forces can shape human communities. The hollow where they once lived is now part of a state forest, accessible only by a strenuous hike through mountainous terrain. Few visitors realize they are walking ground once occupied by one of America's most tragic cases of generational consanguinity. The Caldwell family represents an extreme example of what can happen when communities become completely disconnected from broader society, explains sociologist Dr. Thomas Brennan. Geographic isolation combined with deliberate social separation created conditions where harmful practices could continue for generations without intervention. Modern genetic analysis has provided new insights into cases like the Caldwells. Dr. Patricia Morgan, who specializes in the study of isolated genetic populations, explains, consanguineous relationships dramatically increase the expression of recessive genetic disorders. When close biological relatives produce children, the chance of inheriting 2 copies of harmful recessive genes increases substantially with each generation. The physical and cognitive challenges described in the Caldwell family are consistent with known outcomes of sustained consanguinity. The historical record contains scattered references to other isolated family groups with similar practices throughout Appalachia in the 18th and 19th centuries. However, the Caldwells are unique in their complete disappearance and the documentation that survived them, providing a rare window into the biological and social consequences of extreme isolation. We should view the Caldwell story not as a lurid curiosity but as a human tragedy, urges medical historian Dr. Elizabeth Palmer. These were people operating with severely limited information, whose worldview had been shaped by isolation and likely influenced by the cognitive effects of genetic disorders. Their interpretation of their deteriorating health as a spiritual gift rather than a warning demonstrates how communities can develop explanatory frameworks that ultimately harm them. In 1972, construction workers expanding a rural highway in western North Carolina made a grim discovery that may provide the final piece of the Caldwell puzzle. While clearing land, they uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of 14 individuals. Forensic examination revealed skeletal abnormalities consistent with genetic disorders resulting from consanguinity. Carbon dating placed the burials around 1900 to 1905. The physical evidence from these remains shows classic markers of inbreeding depression, says forensic anthropologist Dr. Lauren Mitchell. Skull abnormalities, dental malformations, and skeletal asymmetries all point to genetic disorders. The location corresponds roughly with the area described in Frederick Wilson's notes of his encounters with Rebecca Caldwell. Among the artifacts recovered from the gravesite was a small tin pendant with crude engravings matching symbols from Jeremiah Caldwell's journal. While DNA testing technology was insufficient in the 1970s to establish a definitive connection, the circumstantial evidence strongly suggests these may have been the remains of the final members of the Caldwell family, if these are indeed the Caldwells. It appears their journey ended as Rebecca described, with the last members of the family dying in close succession. Their bloodline finally extinguished, Dr. Mitchell concludes. The Caldwell story serves as a powerful historical example of the importance of genetic diversity and the dangers of isolation. Modern understanding of genetics has completely transformed how we view consanguinity, removing it from the realm of cultural taboo to that of biological necessity. The superstitions and misinformation that guided the Caldwell's practices have been replaced by scientific understanding. What makes the Caldwell case particularly valuable from a historical perspective is the documentation of how they interpreted their condition, says Dr. Eleanor Simmons. Their belief that they could speak to the dead was likely a combination of auditory hallucinations caused by neurological disorders and a cultural framework that gave those experiences meaning. They created an entire spiritual system around the very genetic deterioration that was destroying them. The abandoned hollow where the Caldwells once lived has been the subject of archaeological study, though little remains beyond foundation stones and the family cemetery. In 2015, ground-penetrating radar revealed several previously undiscovered graves, suggesting the family's mortality rate may have been even higher than historical records indicated. The Caldwell family cemetery tells the story through birth and death dates, explains archaeologist Dr. Robert Chun. Early generations show normal lifespans, but each subsequent generation shows shorter lives and higher infant mortality. By the final generation, few children survived beyond age 5. It's a stark timeline of genetic collapse. If you've watched all the way through this dark chapter of American history, leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can get to know you and understand who truly appreciates the hidden stories from our nation's past. Please subscribe to support our continued exploration of these forgotten histories. Like this video and share it with others who appreciate discovering the untold truths that shaped our world. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Caldwell story is how their isolation prevented them from understanding the cause of their suffering. By the time Jeremiah wrote about renewing the blood, it was already too late for most family members. The genetic damage from generations of consanguinity had reached a point where the family's extinction had become virtually inevitable. Today, the whispers of the Caldwell family echo only in historical records and academic studies. Their hollow has returned to wilderness, the forest reclaiming the ground where their cabins once stood. Yet their story remains a powerful reminder of how isolation, whether geographic, social, or informational, can lead human communities down tragic paths. The irony of the Caldwell family is that they believed they were preserving something sacred, concludes Dr. Harrison. In reality, their practices ensured their own extinction. Their bloodline, which they fought so desperately to keep pure, was weakened with each generation until it could no longer sustain itself. Nature itself provided the verdict that human intervention never had the chance to deliver. In the mist-shrouded mountains of Appalachia, where isolation once allowed such practices to continue unchecked, the only voices now are those of the wind through ancient trees and streams flowing over rocks. Nature's patient reclamation of ground once occupied by a family who believed they could speak with the dead, but who could not hear the warnings carried in their own blood.